unseen poetry. We're going to be thinking about the strategies for unpicking the poem, and I'm also going to show you 3 examples of answers that you can use to help you to write your own answers to the question. So, in terms of approaching unseen poetry, it's really important, and the greatest piece of advice is to say that you need to read the poem several times over. No one is expecting you to be able to read the poem and be able to understand what the writer or what the poet might be trying to say, what the poet's reasons for writing that poem might have been. So it's really important that you dedicate enough time to reading the poem. So my first piece of advice, number 1, is to read the poem. And secondly, you'll be asked a question about that poem, so you need to read the question next. So our question is there, we'll come back to it. Number 3 is to read the poem and then think about the question as you're reading that time. All right, so we'll go through 1, 2, and 3 first of all. So we'll read the poem first of all. Our poem today is called This Is Not a Small Voice. This is not a small voice, do you hear? This is a large voice coming out of these cities. This is the voice of Latanya, Kadesha, Shaniqua. This is the voice of Antoine, Daryl, Shaquille. Running over waters, navigating the hallways of our schools, spilling out on the corners of our cities, and no epitaphs spill out of their river mouths. This is not a small love, you hear. This is a large love, a passion for kissing, learning on its face. This is a love that crowns the feet with hands, that nourishes, conceives, feels the water sails, mends the children. Folds them inside our history, where they toast more than the flesh, where they suck the bones of the alphabet and spit out closed vowels. This is a love coloured with iron and lace. This is a love initialed Black Genius. This is not a small voice, you hear. And you'll notice that there's just a small star asterisk here, and these are the names of Black people who have lost their lives for various reasons, both across in America and in Britain. So we've read the poem once, so we think about our approach. We're now going to read the question. So how does the poet present ideas about the value of everyone's life on earth? So we're going to read the poem again, and this time we're going to be thinking about and potentially highlighting some key quotations that might help us to answer that question about how the poet is presenting the ideas about the value of everyone's life. This is not a small voice you hear. This is a large voice coming out of these cities. This is the voice of Latanya, Kadesha, Shaniqua. This is the voice of Antoine, Daryl, Shaquille. Running over waters, navigating the hallways of our schools, spilling out on the corners of our cities, and no epitaphs spill out of their river mouths. This is not a small love you hear. This is a large love, a passion for kissing, learning on its face. This is a love that crowns the feet with hands, that nourishes, conceives, feels the water sails, mends the children. Folds them inside our history, where they toast more than the flesh, where they suck the bones of the alphabet and spit out closed vowels. This is a love coloured with iron and lace. This is a love initialed Black Genius. This is not a small voice you hear. So you'll see as I was reading that, I was just highlighting some of the quotations that I thought were important in terms of answering this question about the poet valuing everyone's life on earth. Now you might want to highlight other quotations, that's absolutely fine, but we're going to talk through a couple of those, or one in particular, to help you along. So I've read the poem with the question in mind, and I need to think about my overall response to the poem and the question and what do I think this poem is about. And then I need to choose my quotations, one from the beginning, ideally, one from the middle, one from the end, and explore how they answer the question. Okay? So if I'm thinking about what I think this poem is about, I've written my answer here. So I think it's about the strength and love that different groups of people can feel and the value that it holds. The poet seems to suggest that some groups of people may not be heard or valued in society, and this is something which it could be quite damaging. The poem also seems to suggest that a lot of status should be given to learning how to use your voice effectively. So I've summarised what I think this poem is about there. Okay, so I've done question 4. What's your overall response to the question? What do you think the poem is about? So now I'm going to think about my quotations. I'm going to focus on one in particular so I don't steal all of the ideas from you when you go on to look at this poem yourself. So we're going to consider the first couple of lines in this poem. This is not a small voice you hear, it's a large voice coming out of these cities. So I've said, and I'm looking at inference first of all, so what does this quotation suggest as a whole? So it suggests that everyone in the city is entitled to speak if they wish, and they should be listened to. I've then thought about some zooming in, so looking at individual choices of language. And I've said you is direct address. I'm using that terminology. So it's direct address to the reader of the poem. It gets them involved. It also questions whether they have ever left a voice unheard or valued a voice less than another voice. So perhaps there's a kind of accusation or that idea that perhaps the poet is asking the reader to really reflect on their experiences and what they've been involved in. I've then thought about another use of language. So the adjective small suggests that it's delicate and frail, as if it wouldn't be able to be heard. It's far from the truth. And then large juxtaposes this. So we've got that structural vocabulary in there as well. So large creates the impression that it's physical and can be seen. I've also looked at the verb coming out. It links to this idea of that being kind of voices being large, as if they are revolting, they're turning against a situation and become more present within the city and its surroundings. Finally, I've also noticed that in the poem, the way that the poem is structured, there's a gap here. So this is not a small voice you hear, and then there's this pause here. This is a large voice coming out of the cities. So that physical space on line 2 could be the silence that sometimes is felt by people whose voices are not heard by others. So it's the idea that their voices aren't taken up and valued as much as other people's voices. So for your analysis, you can choose to do a similar thing to me, where I've pulled the quotation out of the poem and made some notes around it. But of course, you can go back to your poem and just use the space at the side. The exam paper will always have some space for you to use for your annotation. So either choice is fine. So we've got our introduction, we've thought about what this poem is about, and I've chosen one quotation. So you obviously now would go away and choose 2 more quotations, and you do the same process that I've just taught you through in terms of looking at inference of the entire quotation and then thinking about individual choices of language. Okay, so there's several ways that you can then approach answering your question. So there's different methods. You can use the squeezy structure, which we taught you in school, thinking about how you go in quite a formulaic way through your answer. That's absolutely fine. So you might write 3 squeezy paragraphs for your essay, and that would suffice and be very well structured. You might decide that that's a bit constraining for you, and you might want to read and write more freely. And you need to be just aware of the assessment objectives and the question that you're going on to answer. So just as a reminder, the assessment objectives for this question are here. So you need to read and understand and respond to the text, thinking about your own personal response, how you're going to show what you think, what your inferences are, and using quotations in order to support those. And then AO2, which is language structure and form analysis, and thinking about what the effects of these elements of language and structure are on you as the reader or the listener of the poem. So I've just popped the structure of squeezy there, just in case you need that to refer to. But the last thing that I want to talk through today is 3 choices, 3 example paragraphs, which are vividly highlighted here, for you to use as a basis to write your own answer. So what I always suggest is that this is quite a lengthy introduction. You might not want to write one quite as long as this, but you kind of want to think about your response to the poem first of all. So I asked earlier what you thought the overall poem was about, and your introduction to your answer is kind of a way to be able to explore that. Now, you don't want to be talking for a huge amount of time about what you think the poem is about. You need to get into the way that the poet has presented certain ideas. Sometimes nice just to get you into writing your answer. So I've said the poem is exploring the strength and love that different groups of people can feel for each other. I've gone on to talk about how some people in society may not have their voice valued as much as other people, and it's quite damaging. And the idea that the poet also focuses on learning being really important, and that idea that if we learn about each other, then we're more likely to listen to each other's voices and therefore value each other much more. So I'll leave you to read that in full, but that kind of gives a summary of what my introduction covers. And then we've got 3 answers here, or 3 paragraphs, one for grade 4, one for grade 5, and one for grade 7. So you can see that I've highlighted them, just picking up some key points that you need to be aware are included in your answers. So I've introduced in yellow for each of these paragraphs the idea of your statement, your quotation, and your inference. Okay, so what does that quotation demonstrate? Here I've talked about the same quotation each time, so the one that I planned earlier, but you'll see that in the different answers, different skills are given more or less time in the paragraph. So we'll see in grade 4, you've got a clear statement. At the start of the poem, Sanchez talks directly to the reader. It's not a small voice you hear, it's a large voice coming out of these cities. It suggests that the poet believes that everyone in the city is entitled to speak if they wish, and that they should be listened to. So I've made a clear inference there of what I believe that quotation is telling me, okay, what the poet is trying to communicate. The green highlighting highlights where I've looked at language or structure in particular. So the use of direct address you engages the reader into considering whether they have listened to all of the voices around them and whether some voices are more valued than others. So Sanchez might be commenting on the fact that everyone should be treated equally and with respect, and they should change their behaviour if they don't already do this. So I've highlighted this in the magenta colour because this just highlights to me what I might be saying in terms of the poet's intentions. So what are the poet's intentions overall? I've put in magenta just so that it's really clear that I'm focusing back on the poet and what the poet's intending to do for their audience. So we can see quite straightforward, not a huge amount of detail in any of these sections, but that would secure you if you were to repeat that a few times over for different quotations. That would hopefully secure you a grade 4. To go up into a grade 5, you can see quite clearly that there's more focus on the use of language in the quotation that you've chosen. So you'll see that the yellow actually is pretty much the same. And then we look at the use of the adjective small and what connotations. So we're looking at close language analysis here. It's got connotations of delicacy and fragility, as if the object would not be able to serve its purpose. However, this is juxtaposed, and we're starting to build in this more complex language and terminology here, with the idea that voices are large, and this adjective creates a sense of the physical, as if voices have taken on a physical form in order to be noticed. And I've linked it again structurally, I've linked it to coming out, as it suggests that the voices are joining together and rallying for change. And again, I've done the same thing, focusing back on the poet. It might be commenting on the fact that certain voices have been ignored for too long, and so they are going to become more obvious and that everyone should now listen. So there you can see there's just that little bit more engagement with the quotation. There's more detail, there's more suggestions about what that quotation might suggest to the audience or the reader. For grade 7 then, you can see that there's an increase in detail in volume in this answer. At the start of the poem, Sanchez talks directly to the reader. This is not a small voice you hear, it's a large voice coming out of these cities. This comment, that every voice is entitled to be heard, is accusatory, as if the reader may have not acknowledged or valued a voice in the past. So I've gone slightly deeper into the meanings this time, into the suggestions of what that quotation might be aiming at. The dismissal of the voice as being small, a sign of delicacy or fragility. So we've got those same ideas from the grade 5 response, but we've gone into a bit more detail following it. It's juxtaposed with the presentation that the voices are almost concrete rather than abstract objects. So you've got a more sophisticated explanation there. Sanchez could be presenting the voices as having a physical form to symbolise their status. Then they go back to a bit more exploration. So this description of the voices is furthered when they're described coming out of these cities. It implies that the voices have the strength to be heard far and wide, and so they communicate an important message and are rallying for change. So there I've just linked another quotation in and given an inference about that quotation in particular. And then going on to our poet's intentions. So Sanchez might be commenting on the fact that certain voices have been ignored for too long in society, and so society needs to change in order to ensure that all lives are valued in the same way, and societal prejudices that have operated in the past are eradicated, and every life is protected and every voice is listened to. Sanchez could be making reference to racial prejudice, for example, that the voices of Black and minority ethnic people are undervalued and even ignored in society, and so this needs to be urgently tackled. So I'm starting to think about the bigger ideas here. I'm starting to think about particularly the most recent events that we've seen in the media in terms of the Black Lives Matter rallies, and thinking about how these voices have been fundamentally undervalued in society for a long time. So I'm thinking about my understanding, I'm thinking about what's brought into my mind personally once I read this poem, and thinking about those big ideas that I can link to. And that's what's going to push you up into the grade 7 boundary and beyond. It's thinking about your critical understanding of the poem and your critical thoughts, your personal thoughts about what this poem makes you think of and why. So on this document that you'll receive for your homework this week, you have everything you need in order to write a couple more paragraphs about this poem. So as you can see, I'll send this out with my highlighting, but of course you can choose your own quotations. You've got the question, you've got the process in order to follow in order to answer the question, and you've got your 3 examples, grade 4, grade 5 and grade 7, for you to follow in order to try and achieve the target grade that you would like to achieve in your answer. So for the homework this week, you can write in 2 more paragraphs and 2 more quotations from this poem. Okay.